They called it unprofessional. Said it made her look like she was playing dress-up in a war zone. But when death surrounded them in the Afghan mountains and every other option had failed, Staff Sergeant Isabella Romano's bright pink helmet would become the beacon that guided them all home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The scorching Afghan sun beat down mercilessly on forward operating base Thunder, its rays creating shimmering waves of heat that distorted the rugged mountains of Kunar Province. In the distance, the Pech Valley stretched like a deadly maze of ridges and hidden dangers, where Taliban fighters had been planting improvised explosive devices with increasing frequency. It was here, in this unforgiving landscape, that Staff Sergeant Isabella "Izzy" Romano had spent the last 18 months of her third deployment, and it was here that she had earned both respect and ridicule in equal measure. Izzy knelt beside her equipment, methodically checking each piece of her explosive ordnance disposal gear with the precision that had kept her alive through countless missions. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency over the robotic arm controls, the portable X-ray unit, and the specialized tools that could mean the difference between life and death when facing an IED. But it wasn't her expertise that drew stares from passing soldiers. It was the bright pink combat helmet that sat prominently atop her gear bag. The helmet was pristine, its vibrant color standing out like a neon sign against the muted desert camouflage that dominated everything else on the base. Most soldiers' helmets were covered in dust, scratches, and the inevitable wear of combat operations. Izzy's pink helmet, however, was maintained with almost religious care, its surface gleaming despite the harsh conditions of the Afghan desert. "Romano's playing Barbie again," came a voice from behind her. Captain Trevor Hayes strutted past with his typical swagger, his spotless uniform and perfectly pressed sleeves marking him as someone who spent more time in air-conditioned briefing rooms than in the field. Hayes was the kind of officer who had graduated from West Point with honors, talked a good game about leadership, but had somehow managed to avoid the dangerous assignments that would have tested his theories. Izzy didn't look up from her equipment check. She'd learned long ago that acknowledging Hayes only encouraged him to continue his commentary, but Hayes wasn't finished. He stopped walking and turned to address the small group of soldiers who had gathered to watch the exchange. "Seriously, Romano, when are you going to get a real helmet? This isn't a fashion show." His voice carried across the equipment yard, drawing more attention than Izzy wanted. "The Army issued you proper gear for a reason. That thing makes you look like you're heading to a costume party, not a combat zone." Several soldiers chuckled, though Izzy noticed that none of the enlisted men who had actually worked with her in the field joined in. The laughter came from officers and newer soldiers who knew her reputation but had never seen her work firsthand. To them, she was the EOD specialist with the pink helmet, an oddity that didn't fit their image of what a combat soldier should look like. Sergeant First Class Andre Johnson emerged from the communications tent, his weathered face showing the strain of someone who had been dealing with logistics all morning. Johnson was old-school Army, a career soldier who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan multiple times and had earned his stripes the hard way. He'd been Izzy's strongest supporter since she'd arrived at Phobe Thunder, recognizing her skill even when others focused on her appearance. "Hayes," Johnson called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had been in the Army longer than the captain had been alive. "Don't you have some paperwork to catch up on? I heard Colonel Pierce was looking for those reports you were supposed to submit last week." Hayes's face reddened slightly, but he managed to maintain his composure. "Just making sure our soldiers are maintaining proper military appearance, Sergeant. Standards matter, even out here." "Standards do matter," Johnson agreed, walking over to stand near Izzy's position. "And Romano's got the best-eyed clearance record on this base. Her standards have kept more soldiers alive than your regulations ever will." The tension in the air was palpable as Hayes realized he was being challenged by a senior NCO in front of other soldiers. In the military hierarchy, Johnson technically had to defer to Hayes's rank, but everyone present understood that experience. Trumped bars on a collar when it came to real respect. Her record doesn't change the fact that she's violating uniform regulations. Hayes persisted, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Military appearance is about discipline and unit cohesion. When soldiers start making exceptions for personal preferences, it breaks down the whole system. Izzy finally stood up, her 5'4" frame dwarfed by most of the men around her, but her presence somehow commanding attention. She picked up the pink helmet and examined it carefully, as if seeing it for the first time. "You want to know about this helmet, Captain?" she asked quietly, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of emotion that made everyone lean in to listen. "This helmet belonged to my little sister Sophia. She was 12 years old when she was diagnosed with leukemia. Pink was her favorite. Color said it made her feel strong when everything else in her life was scary and uncertain." The laughter had stopped completely now. Hayes shifted uncomfortably, suddenly realizing that this conversation had taken a turn he hadn't expected. "Sophia wanted to be a soldier like me," Izzy continued, her fingers tracing the smooth surface of the helmet. "She made me promise that when I deployed, I'd wear something pink so she could imagine herself fighting alongside me. She painted this helmet herself during one of her chemo sessions, said it would keep me safe because it carried her love with it." The silence stretched across the equipment yard. Even Hayes seemed to have lost his appetite for confrontation, though his jaw remained set in stubborn defiance. "Sophia died 6 months into my deployment," Izzy said simply. "I've worn this helmet on every mission since then. Not because I'm trying to make a fashion statement, but because I made a promise to a little girl who believed that courage came in all colors." Johnson nodded slowly, his respect for Izzy evident in his expression. Several of the younger soldiers who had been smirking earlier now looked ashamed of their reactions. But Hayes, perhaps feeling that backing down would damage his authority, chose to double down instead. "I'm sorry for your loss, Romano, but personal grief doesn't override military regulations. That helmet is not within Army standards, and it needs to be replaced with proper equipment." His voice had taken on the cold, bureaucratic tone of someone hiding behind rules to avoid dealing with human complexity. "The helmet meets all safety requirements," Izzy replied evenly. "It's been inspected and approved by the armorer. The only thing non-standard about it is the color." "Which is exactly the problem," Hayes shot back. "Soldiers need to look like soldiers, not like they're making political statements or drawing attention to themselves. In combat, blending in can be the difference between life and death." Johnson stepped forward, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Captain, with all due respect, Romano has cleared more IEDs than any other specialist on this base. Her non-standard equipment hasn't prevented her from doing her job effectively." "That's not the point, Sergeant. The point is maintaining discipline and military bearing. If we let soldiers customize their equipment based on personal preferences, where does it end? Pretty soon we'll have rainbow-colored body armor and Hello Kitty weapons." The comparison was offensive and dismissive, reducing Izzy's tribute to her dead sister to a frivolous decoration. Several soldiers who had remained neutral in the conversation now looked openly disapproving of Hayes's comments. "Sir," Lieutenant Chloe Bennett spoke up for the first time. Bennett was relatively new to the base, a communications officer who had arrived just 2 months earlier, but she had quickly developed a reputation for speaking her mind when she witnessed injustice. "Staff Sergeant Romano's equipment record is flawless. Her safety record is exemplary. If the helmet meets technical specifications, perhaps we should focus on results rather than appearance." Hayes turned his attention to Bennett, clearly frustrated that his authority was being questioned by multiple subordinates. Lieutenant, when you've been in the Army as long as I have, you'll understand that maintaining standards isn't optional. It's what separates professional soldiers from militia groups. I understand standards, sir, Bennett replied respectfully but firmly. I also understand that some of the most effective soldiers I've served with were the ones who found ways to carry pieces of home with them. It's what reminds them what they're fighting for. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Diana Pierce, the base commander who had emerged from the operations center with a stack of papers in her hand. Pierce was a no-nonsense officer who had earned her position through competence rather than politics, and her presence immediately changed the dynamic of the group. "What's all the commotion about?" she asked, her eyes scanning the assembled soldiers and quickly identifying the tension in their body language. Hayes straightened to attention, clearly seeing an opportunity to escalate the situation to his advantage. "Colonel, I was addressing a uniform violation with Staff Sergeant Romano. She's been wearing non-regulation equipment that doesn't meet Army appearance standards." Pierce's gaze shifted to Izzy, then to the pink helmet in her hands. The colonel's expression was unreadable as she studied the situation. "Romano," Pierce said finally, "is that the helmet you've been wearing on EOD missions?" "Yes, ma'am," Izzy replied, her voice steady despite the obvious stakes of the conversation. "And has it ever compromised your safety or the safety of your team?" "No, ma'am. It meets all technical specifications for ballistic protection and has been inspected by the armorer multiple times." Pierce nodded slowly, then turned back to Hayes. "Captain, what specific regulation does the helmet violate?" Hayes consulted his mental database of Army regulations, clearly searching for the exact citation that would support his position. AR 672-1 specifies approved colors and patterns for military equipment, Colonel. Personal modifications are prohibited without proper authorization. And who has the authority to approve such modifications? "The commanding officer, ma'am, but nothing, Captain," Pierce interrupted. "As commanding officer of this base, I'm authorizing Staff Sergeant Romano to continue wearing her helmet. Her performance record speaks for itself, and I'm not interested in solving problems that don't exist." Hayes's face flushed red with embarrassment and frustration. He had clearly expected Pierce to support his position, and the public reversal was a significant blow to his credibility. "Ma'am, I respectfully disagree with this decision. Allowing personal customization of equipment sets a dangerous precedent and undermines military discipline." Pierce's expression hardened. "Captain Hayes, I've reviewed your service record. In 18 months at this base, you volunteered for exactly 0 combat missions. Staff Sergeant Romano has cleared over 200 IEDs and saved countless lives. I'm going to trust the judgment of the soldier who's actually doing the dangerous work." The dismissal was complete in public. Hayes had been not just overruled, but humiliated in front of the soldiers he was trying to impress. As he walked away, his shoulders rigid with anger, Izzy could see that she had made an enemy who wouldn't forget this encounter. But for now, she had the support of her commander and the respect of the soldiers who mattered most, the ones who would depend on her skills when the next mission came calling. And in the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, where death lurked in every roadside pile of debris, that next mission was never far away. The mess hall at Forward Operating Base Thunder buzzed with the usual mixture of exhaustion and dark humor that characterized soldiers trying to decompress after long days in hostile territory. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the metal tables where men and women in dusty uniforms picked at their MREs and traded stories about close calls and equipment failures. It was here, in this cramped space that smelled of industrial coffee and reheated food, that the real conversations happened, the ones that revealed what soldiers really thought about each other when the officers weren't watching. Izzy sat at her usual table in the corner, picking at a package of beef stew while reviewing maintenance reports for her EOD equipment. She preferred the quiet corner because it allowed her to focus on her work while still being available if anyone needed to discuss upcoming missions. Her pink helmet sat on the bench beside her, its vibrant color somehow both out of place and perfectly natural in her presence. "I still can't believe Pierce sided with her," came a voice from 2 tables away. Izzy didn't look up, but she recognized the speaker as Lieutenant Marcus Webb, one of Hayes's cronies who had arrived at the base around the same time as the captain. Webb was young, fresh out of officer candidate school, and eager to prove himself by aligning with what he perceived as the winning team. "It's political correctness run amok," replied another voice that Izzy identified as Sergeant Tony Martinez, a supply specialist who had never been on a combat mission, but somehow felt qualified to judge those who had. "The Army's so worried about being inclusive that they're ignoring basic military standards. Next thing you know, they'll be letting soldiers paint flowers on their weapons." The conversation was clearly intended to be overheard. Martinez spoke just loudly enough that his words would carry to Izzy's table while maintaining the pretense of a private discussion. It was a passive-aggressive tactic that allowed him to express his disapproval without directly confronting someone who outranked him. "What gets me is the favoritism," Webb continued, warming to his theme. "Any male soldier tried to customize his equipment like that, he'd be written up faster than you could say court-martial. But because she's a woman with a sob story, she gets special treatment." Private First Class Danny Morrison, a 19-year-old from Ohio who had been in country for only 6 weeks, leaned forward with obvious interest. Morrison was still trying to figure out the complex social dynamics of the base, and conversations like this one shaped his understanding of who mattered and who didn't. "What's the deal with the helmet anyway?" Morrison asked, his voice carrying the curiosity of someone who hadn't yet learned that some questions were better left unasked. "She claims it belonged to her dead sister," Martinez replied with obvious skepticism. "Convenient excuse for breaking regulations. Everyone's got a sob story doesn't mean we should throw out military discipline because someone's feelings might get hurt." The casual dismissal of Sophia's memory hit Izzy like a physical blow. She had shared that story publicly only once during the confrontation with Hayes, and already it was being twisted into something manipulative and false. She forced herself to continue reading her maintenance reports, knowing that engaging with the conversation would only escalate the situation and prove their point about emotional instability. Lieutenant Chloe Bennett entered the mess hall and immediately noticed the tension in the air. Bennett had developed a talent for reading social dynamics, a skill that had served her well in the male-dominated environment of military communications. She could see Izzy hunched over her paperwork, obviously listening to the conversation but trying to ignore it, while the group at the nearby table continued their character assassination with obvious satisfaction. "Mind if I sit?" Bennett asked, sliding onto the bench across from Izzy without waiting for an answer. Her voice was deliberately loud enough to interrupt the other conversation and signal that Izzy wasn't sitting alone. "Of course," Izzy replied, grateful for the intervention, even though she would never have asked for it. Bennett's presence immediately shifted the dynamic in the mess hall, forcing the other soldiers to either continue their discussion in front of an officer or find something else to talk about. "How are the equipment checks going?" Bennett asked, genuinely interested in Izzy's work. As the communications officer, Bennett understood the critical importance of reliable equipment in combat situations, and she had developed a healthy respect for the specialists who maintained the technical systems that kept everyone alive. "Everything's in good condition," Izzy replied, closing her folder and giving Bennett her full attention. "The robot arm needs some calibration work, but it should be ready for the next mission. How are the radio systems holding up?" "Better than expected, actually. We upgraded the encryption protocols last week and the new frequency hopping algorithms." Seem to be working well. The Taliban haven't been able to jam our communications like they were doing last month. The technical discussion served multiple purposes. It demonstrated Izzy's professional competence to anyone listening, established Bennett as an ally willing to engage with controversial soldiers, and shifted the conversation away from personal attacks toward mission-relevant topics. The soldiers at the nearby table gradually lost interest and found other subjects to discuss, but the damage had been done. The conversation had revealed the depth of resentment that existed beneath the surface politeness of military hierarchy. Izzy realized that Hayes's public challenge had emboldened others to question not just her equipment choices, but her motivations, her integrity, and her right to be treated as an equal member of the team. "Don't let them get to you," Bennett said quietly, recognizing the hurt in Izzy's expression. "Martinez has never been outside the wire, and Webb is still trying to figure out which end of his rifle the bullets come out of. Their opinions don't matter when the real work needs to be done." "It's not about their opinions," Izzy replied, her voice heavy with the weariness of someone who had fought this battle too many times. "It's about what happens when those opinions become policy. When commanders start believing that solidarity is more important than competence. When soldiers in the field start questioning whether they can trust me to watch their backs because I don't look like their idea of what a warrior should look like." Bennett nodded, understanding the deeper implications of the seemingly superficial conflict. Military effectiveness depended on trust, and trust required confidence in each other's abilities and commitment. When that confidence was undermined by prejudice and stereotyping, it created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. "You know what I think," Bennett said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "I think some people are threatened by competence that doesn't fit their expectations. It's easier to dismiss someone's abilities than to admit that their own assumptions might be wrong." The observation was astute and probably accurate, but it didn't solve the fundamental problem. Izzy was fighting a war on two fronts against the Taliban forces that planted IEDs throughout the Pech Valley, and against the prejudice and resentment of some of her own comrades. Both enemies were dangerous, though in different ways. Sergeant Romano called Chief Warrant Officer Patricia Donovan as she approached their table. Donovan was the senior EOD technician on the base, a 20-year veteran who had earned her rank through expertise rather than politics. Her opinion carried weight with everyone from enlisted soldiers to senior officers, and her support could make the difference between acceptance and isolation. "Yes, Chief?" Izzy replied, straightening in her seat out of respect for Donovan's experience and position. "I need to talk to you about the equipment inventory. We've got a discrepancy in the C4 count that needs to be resolved before the next supply convoy arrives." Donovan's tone was businesslike, but her decision to conduct the conversation publicly served the same purpose as Bennett's presence. It demonstrated that senior personnel continued to treat Izzy as a valued member of the team. "Of course, Chief. I can pull the usage logs and cross-reference them with the mission reports. Should have an answer for you within the hour." "Good. Also, I heard about the helmet situation. For what it's worth, I think Pierce made the right call. Results matter more than appearances, and your results speak for themselves." The endorsement from Donovan carried significant weight, and Izzy felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. But even as she appreciated the support, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Hayes wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully, and his humiliation in front of the other soldiers would only intensify his desire to prove that his position had been correct. As the mess hall began to empty for the evening shift change, Izzy gathered her paperwork and prepared to return to her equipment checks. Tomorrow would bring new missions, new dangers, and new opportunities for her critics to question her judgment and her place in the unit. She picked up her pink helmet and examined it in the harsh fluorescent light, thinking about Sophia's bright smile and unshakable faith in her big sister's ability to make a difference. The helmet had become more than just protective equipment. It was a symbol of the values and relationships that made the fight worthwhile. But symbols, as Izzy was learning, could be both sources of strength and targets for those who wanted to tear down what they didn't understand. The real test would come when the shooting started and everyone's true priorities were revealed under fire. The pre-dawn air at Forward Operating Base Thunder carried the crisp bite of mountain altitude, even in the midst of Afghan summer. At 05:00 hours, the operations center hummed with activity as intelligence officers updated maps, communications. Specialists tested radio frequencies, and senior leaders prepared for the day's mission briefings. The overhead fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the tactical maps that covered every available wall space, showing the complex terrain of the Pech Valley with its maze of ridges, villages, and known enemy positions. Colonel Diana Pierce stood at the head of the briefing room, her weathered hands pointing to specific locations on the large-scale map that dominated the front wall. Around the rectangular table sat the key players for what intelligence suggested would be one of the most dangerous missions attempted from Phobe Thunder in recent months. Captain Trevor Hayes occupied a prominent seat near the colonel, his notebook open and pen ready, projecting the image of an engaged and competent officer despite his limited field experience. "Gentlemen and ladies," Pierce began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned respect through competence rather than politics. "We have a critical situation developing in the Korangal Valley. Intelligence reports indicate that Taliban forces have established a new supply route through the mountain passes, and they're using increasingly sophisticated IED tactics to protect their logistics operations." She moved to a detailed topographic map that showed the treacherous terrain of the target area. The valley was a maze of narrow trails, steep cliffs, and hidden caves that had provided sanctuary for insurgent forces for decades. Even experienced soldiers who knew the area well considered it one of the most dangerous operational environments. In Afghanistan, yesterday's drone reconnaissance confirmed the presence of at least 3 separate IED emplacements along the main supply route. Pierce continued, pointing to red markers that indicated known explosive devices. "These aren't simple pressure plate devices or command-detonated charges. Intelligence suggests they're using daisy chain configurations with multiple redundant triggers, possibly including infrared sensors and cell phone detonators." Lieutenant Colonel Michael Barnes, the operations officer, leaned forward with obvious concern. "Colonel, that level of sophistication suggests they've got bomb makers with advanced training. This isn't typical Taliban improvisation. Someone with serious technical knowledge is helping them." "Agreed," Pierce replied. "Which is why we need our most experienced personnel leading this clearance operation. The mission profile calls for a combined arms approach: infantry security, EID clearance, and communications support working in close coordination." Hayes straightened in his chair, sensing an opportunity to volunteer for a high-visibility mission. That would demonstrate his leadership capabilities without requiring him to actually handle explosive devices. "Colonel, I'd like to volunteer to lead the security element. My platoon has been training extensively for this type of operation." Pierce consulted her notes, reviewing Hayes' service record and recent performance evaluations. "Captain Hayes, your platoon has good ratings for base security and convoy escort duties, but this mission requires specialized expertise in IED identification and disposal. We need personnel who can recognize advanced trigger mechanisms and sophisticated placement patterns." "Ma'am, I understand the technical challenges, but leadership and tactical coordination are equally important. My job would be to provide security while the specialists handle the technical aspects." Hayes' response was carefully crafted to emphasize his role without claiming expertise he didn't possess. Sergeant First Class Andre Johnson, who had been quietly observing the discussion, cleared his throat and addressed the colonel directly. "Ma'am, if I may suggest, Staff Sergeant Romano has the most experience with complex IED systems on this base. She's cleared over 200 devices, including several daisy chain configurations similar to what intelligence is describing. The mention of Izzy's name caused a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Several officers exchanged glances, and Hayes's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. The pink helmet controversy had become common knowledge throughout the base, and opinions about Izzy had become a litmus test for broader attitudes about military tradition versus practical effectiveness. Romano is certainly qualified, Pierce acknowledged, but this mission requires seamless integration between multiple specialties. Team cohesion and mutual trust are critical when operating in such dangerous terrain. Hayes saw his opening and seized it with calculated precision. Colonel, with all due respect, Staff Sergeant Romano's recent ... circumstances might compromise team unity. Some soldiers have expressed concerns about her commitment to military standards, and those concerns could create hesitation in critical moments. It was a masterful piece of political maneuvering. Hayes had managed to reference the helmet controversy without directly stating his opposition, framing his objection in terms of unit cohesion rather than personal bias. The implication was clear. Izzy's insistence on wearing the pink helmet had created division within the ranks, and that division could prove fatal during a complex mission. Lieutenant Bennett, who had been studying the mission parameters, spoke up from her position at the communications console. "Sir, I've reviewed the technical requirements for this operation, and the communications challenges are going to be significant. The terrain will create dead zones and interference patterns that could isolate individual team members for extended periods. We need personnel who can operate independently when radio contact is compromised." Her intervention was skillfully crafted to highlight Izzy's strengths without directly challenging Hayes's concerns. Bennett understood that arguing for Izzy's inclusion based on emotional or fairness grounds would be counterproductive, but emphasizing her technical competence and independence addressed the mission's actual requirements. Chief, Warrant Officer Patricia Donovan entered the briefing room with a stack of technical manuals and updated intelligence reports. As the senior EAD specialist on the base, her presence immediately shifted the focus toward the technical aspects of the mission. "Colonel," Donovan began, "I've been analyzing the intelligence photos from yesterday's reconnaissance, and these EAD placements show several concerning patterns. The spacing suggests they're using proximity sensors with overlapping fields of detection, and the positioning indicates knowledge of how our clearance teams typically operate." She spread several photographs across the table, pointing to barely visible disturbances in the dirt that marked potential explosive locations. "These aren't random placements. Someone with intimate knowledge of our procedures is designing these systems specifically to defeat our standard clearance protocols." Hayes studied the photographs with obvious discomfort, realizing that the technical complexity was far beyond his understanding. "Chief Donovan, what specific expertise do we need to address these advanced systems?" "Sir, we need someone who understands not just how to disarm individual devices, but how to analyze the overall pattern and predict where additional charges might be placed." Romano has demonstrated that kind of systems thinking approach in previous missions. The endorsement from Donovan carried significant weight, given her 20 years of experience and reputation for objective assessment of personnel capabilities. But Hayes wasn't ready to concede the argument. "Chief, I appreciate Romano's technical skills, but leadership involves more than just technical competence. This mission will require split-second decisions under extreme pressure, and any hesitation or uncertainty could get people killed. Given the recent ... discussions about her equipment choices, I'm concerned about whether the team can maintain complete confidence in her judgment." It was another carefully crafted attack that used the helmet controversy to question Izzy's decision-making abilities without directly stating that her gender or appearance were factors. Hayes was positioning himself as someone concerned about mission success, rather than someone pursuing a personal vendetta. Pierce listened to the exchange with the expression of a commander who understood that personnel decisions involved both technical qualifications and unit dynamics. The reality of military operations was that perceptions and relationships could be as important as individual competence when lives were at stake. "Here's what we're going to do," Pierce announced, making a decision that would satisfy protocol while maintaining flexibility. "Captain Hayes will lead the overall mission as security commander. Chief Donovan will oversee EOD operations. Staff Sergeant Romano will serve as the primary technician for device analysis and disposal." Hayes's face showed satisfaction at being named mission commander, while Donovan nodded her approval of the technical arrangement. But the structure Pierce had created was more complex than it appeared. By placing Donovan in charge of EOD operations, she had ensured that Izzy would have top cover from the most respected explosive specialist on the base. "Sir," Hayes said, "carefully, I want to ensure that all team members are fully committed to following standard operating procedures and maintaining unit cohesion throughout the mission." Pierce's eyes narrowed slightly, recognizing the implied criticism of Izzy's non-standard equipment choices. "Captain Hayes, I expect all personnel to perform their duties with the professionalism and expertise they've demonstrated in previous operations." Staff Sergeant Romano's record speaks for itself. The rebuke was subtle but clear, and Hayes realized he had pushed as far as he could without openly challenging the colonel's authority. The mission parameters were set, but the underlying tensions remained unresolved. As the briefing concluded and officers began filing out to prepare their teams, Izzy remained notably absent from the planning discussion that would determine how her expertise would be utilized in the field. The exclusion was deliberate. Hayes had managed to structure the mission in a way that marginalized her input while still utilizing her technical skills. Outside the operations center, dawn was breaking. Over the mountains of Kunar Province, painting the peaks in shades of gold and orange that masked the deadly beauty of the Afghan landscape. Somewhere in those mountains, Taliban bomb makers were preparing sophisticated explosive devices designed to kill American soldiers, while at Fob Thunder, American officers were engaged in their own form of warfare, a battle for control, recognition, and the right to determine who belonged in the fight. The mission launched at 0800 hours under a cloudless Afghan sky that promised scorching temperatures by midday. Captain Trevor Hayes led the convoy of 4 heavily armored vehicles through the narrow mountain roads toward the Corindal Valley, his radio crackling with routine position reports and status updates. In the lead vehicle, Hayes maintained constant communication with Fob Thunder while projecting the confidence of an experienced field commander. Despite the nervous energy that betrayed his limited combat experience, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Staff Sergeant Isabella Romano rode in the third vehicle, her EOD equipment secured around her in careful arrangements that reflected years of experience in mobile operations. Her pink helmet rested on her lap, its vibrant colors standing out starkly against the muted desert camouflage that filled the cramped interior. She had been excluded from the final planning session, receiving her mission parameters through Chief Warrant Officer Donovan rather than directly from the mission commander, a slight that spoke volumes about Hayes's attitude toward her participation. "Romeo 6, this is Thunder Base," crackled the radio as Colonel Pierce's voice reached them from the operations center. "Weather reports indicate possible storm activity developing in your area of operations. Be advised that extraction timing may be affected." Hayes keyed his microphone with obvious irritation. "Thunder Base, Romeo 6. Weather is clear in our immediate area. We're proceeding according to planned timeline." But Hayes was focused on the political implications of the mission rather than the tactical realities of mountain weather. Storm systems in the Afghan mountains could develop with frightening speed. turning clear skies into lethal mazes of lightning, flash floods, and zero visibility within minutes. Experienced field commanders learned to respect the mountain's capacity for sudden violence, but Hayes was more concerned with completing the mission on schedule than adapting to changing conditions. The convoy reached the first checkpoint without incident, a small observation post manned by Afghan National Army soldiers who provided intelligence about recent Taliban activity in the area. The reports were concerning increased radio chatter, unusual movement patterns, and evidence of sophisticated equipment being transported through the valley during nighttime hours. "Sir," Sergeant First Class Andre Johnson reported from the lead vehicle, "the UNA commander says they've observed unusual coordination between different Taliban cells in this area. Suggests they're planning something bigger than routine harassment." Hayes dismissed the warning with the casual confidence of someone who had never faced organized enemy resistance. "Johnson, the NA sees conspiracies everywhere. Our intelligence indicates scattered IED placement, not coordinated attacks. We stick to the mission plan." Corporal Nathan Cross, the team's communications specialist, monitored multiple radio frequencies while tracking the convoy's progress on his GPS system. Cross was a competent soldier with 2 previous deployments, and his instincts had been shaped by enough close calls to recognize when situations were developing beyond their initial parameters. "Captain," Cross called out, "I'm picking up increased radio traffic on frequencies associated with Taliban command and control. The pattern suggests they're tracking our movement and coordinating some kind of response." Again, Hayes chose to minimize the warning rather than adapt his approach. "Cross, radio chatter is normal in this area. The Taliban knows we conduct operations here. That doesn't mean they're planning anything specific against our mission." The first sign of serious trouble came when the convoy reached the entrance to the valley where the IED clearance operation was scheduled to begin. Chief Donovan, riding in the second vehicle, immediately recognized that the tactical situation had changed significantly since the intelligence briefings. "All stations, this is EOD lead." Donovan's voice carried the authority of someone who had survived countless dangerous missions. "I'm seeing fresh disturbances in the road surface that weren't present in yesterday's reconnaissance photos. Someone has been working in this area since our last intelligence update." Hayes's response revealed the fundamental flaw in his approach to leadership, an unwillingness to acknowledge information that contradicted his predetermined plans. "EOD lead, we have current intelligence about IED locations. Let's proceed with clearance operations according to the briefing parameters." But Donovan had learned to trust her instincts over briefing slides. "Romeo 6, I'm recommending we halt the convoy and conduct a detailed assessment before proceeding. The disturbance patterns suggest a more complex IED network than we anticipated." "Negative, EOD lead. We're behind schedule already, and we need to complete this mission before weather conditions deteriorate. Proceed with standard clearance protocols." Order reflected Hayes's inexperience with the realities of explosive ordnance disposal. Standard protocols were designed for predictable situations, but the intelligence indicators suggested they were facing an adaptive enemy who had modified their tactics specifically to defeat American clearance procedures. Izzy keyed her radio. From the third vehicle, her voice calm but urgent. "EOD lead, I'm seeing metallic signatures on my detection equipment that don't match the briefing materials. The spacing and intensity suggest we're looking at a coordinated defensive system rather than individual devices." Her assessment was based on years of experience reading the subtle signatures that distinguished simple explosives from complex defensive networks. But Hayes had already decided that her input was unwelcome, particularly when it contradicted his desire to complete the mission quickly and efficiently. "Romano, maintain radio discipline and follow established procedures," Hayes replied curtly. "We're not deviating from the mission plan based on speculation." The dismissal of Izzy's expertise proved to be a critical error. Within minutes, the convoy's advance elements triggered the first in a series of interconnected explosive devices that had been carefully positioned to channel vehicles into an elaborate kill zone. The initial blast disabled the lead vehicle and wounded 2 soldiers, but it was only the beginning of a coordinated ambush that demonstrated sophisticated planning and intimate knowledge of American tactics. IED strike! IED strike! Johnson's voice filled the radio frequencies as smoke and debris erupted around the convoy. Lead vehicle is disabled, casualties reported. We're taking small arms fire from multiple positions. The Taliban had used the IED placement as bait, drawing the American convoy into a predetermined killing ground where concealed fighters could engage from protected positions. The sophisticated explosive network that Izzy had attempted to warn about was designed not just to destroy vehicles, but to immobilize the convoy long enough for coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Hayes found himself in command of a deteriorating tactical situation that bore no resemblance to the clean mission profile he had studied in the air-conditioned briefing room. The carefully planned timeline had collapsed within minutes, and the standard procedures he had insisted upon were proving inadequate against an enemy who had anticipated and countered every American tactical doctrine. Romeo 6, this is Thunder Base. Colonel Pierce's voice cut through the chaos of radio traffic. Report your status and casualty count. Hayes struggled to maintain composure as automatic weapons fire echoed through the valley, and his carefully planned mission disintegrated into a desperate fight for survival. Thunder Base, Romeo 6, we've sustained casualties and are taking effective fire from unknown number of enemy positions. Requesting immediate close air support. But the storm system that Hayes had dismissed was already beginning to develop, creating cloud cover that would complicate air support operations and limit visibility for both ground forces and aircraft. The mountain weather that experienced commanders learned to respect was about to demonstrate why tactical flexibility mattered more than rigid adherence to predetermined plans. In the third vehicle, Izzy checked her equipment and prepared for the reality that Hayes's poor decision-making had created. The sophisticated IED network she had tried to warn about was still largely intact, creating a deadly maze that would have to be navigated under fire if any of them were going to make it home alive. The mission had become a disaster, but the real test of leadership and competence was just beginning. In the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, where enemy forces had turned American predictability into a tactical advantage, survival would depend on the courage and expertise of soldiers like Izzy Romano, whether their commanders valued that expertise or not. The valley erupted into chaos as Taliban fighters emerged from concealed positions that had been prepared weeks in advance. The sophisticated ambush demonstrated a level of tactical coordination that American intelligence had severely underestimated. With overlapping fields of fire that turned the narrow mountain road into a deadly funnel where escape seemed impossible. Captain Trevor Hayes crouched behind the armored hull of his disabled vehicle, his radio crackling with desperate calls for support while automatic weapons fire echoed off the canyon walls. Thunder Base, Romeo 6, Hayes called, his voice betraying the panic he was trying to suppress. We need immediate extraction. The convoy is pinned down and taking effective fire from at least 6 positions. Our lead vehicle is destroyed, and we have multiple casualties. Colonel Pierce's response came through the static of long-distance communications. Romeo 6, close air support is en route, but weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Storm cells are moving into your area faster than predicted. You may need to establish a defensive perimeter and wait for conditions to improve. The prospect of remaining trapped in the kill zone for hours was unacceptable, but Hayes's limited combat experience left him struggling to develop alternatives. The standard protocols he had memorized in training assumed air support availability and clear weather conditions assumptions that were proving dangerously unrealistic in the fluid environment of mountain warfare. "Sir," Sergeant Johnson called. From his position near the disabled lead vehicle, "We've got Corporal Davis and Private Miller with serious wounds. They need medical evacuation, but the LZ is on the other side of that IED field. We can't move casualties through there without clearing a path." Hayes consulted his map, trying to identify alternative routes that would bypass the explosive devices while providing cover from enemy fire. But every potential path led through terrain that offered concealment for additional IEDs or exposed his soldiers to direct fire from Taliban positions. The tactical situation was rapidly becoming untenable. Chief Warrant Officer Donovan had established a temporary command post behind the second vehicle, using its armored bulk as protection while she assessed the explosive threats that blocked every escape route. Her 20 years of experience had taught her to recognize the signatures of complex defensive systems, and what she saw in the Korengal Valley represented some of the most sophisticated IED networks she had encountered. "Captain Hayes," Donovan called over the sound of incoming fire, "I need to brief you on the explosive situation. We're not dealing with random IED placement. This is a coordinated defensive network designed specifically to trap vehicles in this location." Hayes crawled over to Donovan's position, his pristine uniform now torn and dusty from the realities of combat operations. "Chief, what are our options for getting out of here?" Donovan spread a hazily sketched map on the ground, marking the known and suspected explosive locations based on her preliminary reconnaissance. "Sir, the IEDs are positioned in overlapping patterns that channel movement into predetermined kill zones. Standard clearance procedures would take hours, and we don't have hours with wounded soldiers and enemy forces maintaining observation. Then what do you recommend?" Hayes asked, his voice carrying the desperation of someone realizing that his theoretical knowledge was inadequate for the current crisis. "Sir, we need someone who can read the pattern and identify the safest route through the network. Romano has the most experience with complex systems like this. She's developed techniques for rapid assessment that could save us critical time." Hayes's jaw tightened at the mention of Izzy's name. Even in the midst of a life-threatening crisis, his personal animosity toward her remained a factor in his decision-making process. "Chief, we need to follow established procedures. Romano's unconventional methods might work in controlled situations, but we can't take chances with soldiers' lives." The irony of Hayes's statement was lost on him. His insistence on following standard procedures had already placed soldiers' lives in jeopardy, while the unconventional approach he rejected might represent their only realistic chance of survival. "Lieutenant." Chloe Bennett had established communications with both Fob Thunder and the incoming air support elements, but the news she received was increasingly grim. "Captain, close air support is being delayed by the storm system. Lightning activity is preventing helicopter operations, and fixed-wing aircraft can't provide effective support in these weather conditions." The meteorological situation was rapidly becoming as dangerous as the tactical one. The storm system that Hayes had dismissed during the morning briefing was now generating lightning strikes and severe turbulence that grounded aircraft throughout the region. The convoy was effectively cut off from external support, with only their organic capabilities available for self-extraction. "Sir," Corporal Cross reported from his communications position, "I'm monitoring Taliban radio traffic, and they're coordinating additional forces to reinforce this position. Intelligence estimates suggest we could be facing a significantly larger force within the next hour." Hayes absorbed this information with growing alarm. The tactical situation was deteriorating faster than his ability to develop effective responses, and every passing minute brought new complications that stretched his limited experience beyond its breaking point. From her position in the third vehicle, Izzy monitored the radio traffic while conducting her own assessment of the explosive threats that surrounded the convoy. Her specialized detection equipment was providing data that contradicted the intelligence briefings and revealed the true sophistication of the Taliban defensive network. "EOD lead, this is Romano," she called to Donovan. "I'm detecting metallic signatures that suggest anti-personnel devices integrated with the vehicle-borne IEDs. The system is designed to defeat dismounted clearance teams as well as vehicles." Donovan understood the implications immediately. Anti-personnel devices meant that standard foot-mobile clearance procedures would expose soldiers to additional explosive threats specifically designed to kill EOD technicians. The Taliban had created a defensive system that anticipated and countered every element of American doctrine. "Romeo 6, Donovan called to Hayes. "The explosive situation is more complex than we initially assessed. We need to consider alternative approaches to clearance operations." But Hayes remained focused on the procedures he understood rather than adapting to the reality of the situation. "Chief, we follow standard protocols. I'm not authorizing experimental techniques when soldiers' lives are at stake." The conversation was interrupted by increased enemy fire as Taliban forces attempted to maneuver closer to the trapped convoy. Hayes found himself commanding a desperate defensive action while wounded soldiers required immediate medical attention, and every potential escape route remained blocked by sophisticated explosive devices. "Sir," Johnson called urgently, "Davis is going into shock. We need to get him to medical facilities soon, or we're going to lose him." The mounting casualties added another layer of pressure to an already impossible situation. Hayes had to choose between maintaining his rigid adherence to standard procedures and accepting help from the soldier whose expertise he had consistently dismissed. The decision would determine not only the success of the mission, but the survival of the soldiers under his command. As automatic weapons fire continued to echo through the valley and storm clouds gathered overhead, the limitations of Hayes's leadership approach were becoming fatally apparent. The mountain warfare environment demanded flexibility, innovation, and the wisdom to utilize every available resource, qualities that Hayes had failed to develop during his career of avoiding dangerous assignments. In the cramped confines of the third vehicle, Izzy checked her equipment one final time and prepared for the possibility that she would have to act without official authorization. The pink helmet that had generated so much controversy sat ready beside her, a symbol of personal commitment that might soon become the difference between survival and disaster for the soldiers trapped in the Korangal Valley. The sound of Corporal Davis's labored breathing filled the radio as his condition deteriorated rapidly from blood loss and shock. Sergeant Johnson's voice carried the urgency of a combat medic who understood that time was running out for his wounded comrade. "Romeo 6, Davis needs immediate evacuation. His blood pressure is dropping, and I can't stabilize him in these conditions. We've got maybe 20 minutes before we lose him." Captain Hayes crouched behind the armored vehicle, his radio handset trembling slightly as he struggled to coordinate multiple crisis situations simultaneously. The Taliban fire had intensified, with muzzle flashes visible from at least 8 different positions around the trapped convoy. The sophisticated IED network continued to block every escape route, while storm clouds gathered overhead with the promise of lightning strikes that would ground any potential air support for hours. "Thunder Base, Romeo 6, Hayes called desperately. "We need immediate medical evacuation for critical casualties. Can you provide any ground-based extraction options?" Colonel Pierce's response carried the weight of a commander who understood the tactical realities better than her field commander. "Romeo 6, all helicopter assets are grounded due to weather conditions. Ground-based quick reaction force would take minimum 2 hours to reach your position, and they'd face the same IED network that has you trapped." The mathematics of survival were becoming clear to everyone except Hayes. Standard procedures and external support were not going to save the soldiers dying in the Korangal Valley. The solution, if one existed, would have to come from within the convoy's organic capabilities and the expertise of Soldiers who understood unconventional approaches to impossible problems. Chief Warrant. Officer Donovan made the decision that Hayes should have made 30 minutes earlier. Captain, she called across the defensive perimeter, I'm recommending that we authorize Romano to conduct rapid reconnaissance of the IED network. Her detection methods might identify a viable extraction route. Hayes's response revealed the depth of his personal prejudice, even in the face of mounting casualties. Chief, we cannot authorize experimental procedures when soldiers' lives are at stake. Romano's methods haven't been validated through proper testing protocols. The statement was both ironic and tragic. Hayes was refusing to risk soldiers' lives on unproven methods while those same soldiers were dying because proven methods had failed completely. His inability to adapt his thinking to the tactical reality demonstrated the fundamental flaw in leadership that prioritized procedure over results. Sir, Lieutenant Bennett interrupted from her communications position, I've been monitoring Taliban radio traffic, and they're discussing plans to assault our position directly. Intelligence suggests they're waiting for additional reinforcements before launching a coordinated attack. The prospect of a direct assault added another layer of urgency to an already desperate situation. The convoy's defensive position was strong enough to repel small-scale harassment, but a coordinated attack by a larger Taliban force would overwhelm their capabilities within minutes. From her position in the third vehicle, Izzy listened to the radio traffic with growing frustration. Every minute of delay increased the likelihood that Davis and the other wounded soldiers would die, while Hayes remained locked in a mindset that valued theoretical purity over practical effectiveness. She had spent 3 deployments developing techniques for rapid IED assessment that could save critical time in exactly these circumstances, but those techniques required trust and authorization that Hayes seemed unwilling to provide. Chief Donovan, Izzy called on the radio, I'm seeing electromagnetic signatures that suggest the IED network has vulnerable points where the connectivity is weaker. If I can get closer to the defensive line, I might be able to identify a route that avoids the primary kill zones. Donovan understood immediately what Izzy was proposing, a quote, high-risk reconnaissance mission that would put her in direct danger but could potentially save the entire convoy. Romano, that would require you to advance beyond our defensive perimeter under enemy observation. The risk level is extreme. Chief, the risk of staying here is becoming extreme too. Davis doesn't have time for us to wait for perfect solutions. Hayes overheard the exchange and intervened with characteristic rigidity. Negative. I'm not authorizing any personnel to leave the defensive perimeter. We maintain security and wait for external support. But external support was not coming, and everyone except Hayes seemed to understand that reality. The storm system was intensifying, Taliban reinforcements were en route, and casualties were mounting while the mission commander clung to procedures that had already proven inadequate. Sergeant Johnson, who had been treating Davis while monitoring the command discussions, finally reached his breaking point. Sir, with all due respect, Davis is going to die if we don't do something in the next 15 minutes. Romano's our best chance of finding a way out of here. Hayes turned toward Johnson with visible anger. Sergeant, I don't need tactical advice from a medic. My responsibility is to ensure the safety of all personnel, not to risk additional lives on unproven theories. The exchange crystallized the fundamental conflict between Hayes's theoretical approach to leadership and the practical realities of combat operations. While he focused on risk management and procedural compliance, soldiers under his command were bleeding to death in a tactical situation that demanded immediate action. Izzy made the decision that would define not only her own career but the survival chances of every soldier in the convoy. Chief Donovan, I'm going to conduct reconnaissance of the IED network with or without official authorization. Davis and the others don't have time for us to debate protocol. The statement represented a direct challenge to Hayes's authority. A violation of military hierarchy that could result in court-martial proceedings if they survived the current crisis. But Izzy had learned through 3 deployments that sometimes doing the right thing required accepting personal consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Hayes's response was immediate and predictable. "Romano, you are ordered to remain in position and maintain defensive posture. Any unauthorized movement will be considered insubordination and dealt with accordingly." But Donovan, whose experience and authority carried weight even with reluctant commanders, provided the support that Izzy needed. "Captain Hayes, as senior EOD technician, I'm authorizing Romano to conduct technical reconnaissance within her area of expertise. The mission requirements justify the risk." The bureaucratic maneuvering gave Izzy the cover she needed to act. Though everyone understood that Hayes would hold her personally responsible for any negative outcomes, she gathered her detection equipment and prepared to leave the relative safety of the convoy's defensive perimeter, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether her unconventional methods could accomplish what standard procedures had failed to achieve. "Romano," Hayes called as she prepared to move, his voice carrying both authority and personal animosity. "If this goes wrong, you'll be held accountable for every casualty that results." Izzy strapped on her pink helmet and checked her equipment. One final time. "Sir, if this goes wrong, accountability won't matter because we'll all be dead. But if it goes right, maybe Davis and the others will make it home to their families." The pink helmet that had generated so much controversy was about to become either a beacon of hope or a symbol of tragic overconfidence. In the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, where Taliban forces had turned American predictability into a tactical advantage, Staff Sergeant Isabella Romano was preparing to risk everything on the unconventional expertise that her commanders had consistently dismissed. Staff Sergeant Isabella Romano slipped from the relative safety of the convoy's defensive perimeter into the deadly maze of the Pech Valley, her pink helmet gleaming like a beacon in the harsh Afghan sunlight. The electromagnetic detection equipment strapped to her back hummed quietly as it analyzed the invisible signatures of buried explosives, while Taliban fighters watched from concealed positions less than 200 meters away. Every step carried the possibility of triggering sophisticated anti-personnel devices designed specifically to kill soldiers like her. "Romano, this is Chief Donovan," came the voice through her radio earpiece. "I'm tracking your movement from my position. Remember, the pattern analysis suggests overlapping fields of detection, so maintain spacing of at least 5 meters between potential device locations." Izzy acknowledged the guidance while focusing on the readouts from her specialized equipment. The electromagnetic signatures painted a complex picture of buried metal objects, some of which represented legitimate explosive threats, while others were decoys designed to confuse clearance operations. Her years of experience had taught her to distinguish between real devices and Taliban misdirection tactics, but the sophistication of this network exceeded anything she had encountered in previous deployments. The first major obstacle appeared. 50 meters from the convoy, a section of road where multiple electromagnetic signatures suggested a cluster of interconnected devices. Standard clearance protocols would require hours of careful excavation and analysis, but Davis didn't have hours. Izzy needed to find a way through the network that balanced speed with survival, using techniques she had developed through countless high-risk missions. "Chief, I'm seeing a pattern here that doesn't match typical Taliban placement strategies," Izzy reported quietly, her voice barely audible over the sound of distant gunfire. "The spacing and depth signatures suggest someone with formal engineering training designed this system." Donovan's response carried the concern of someone who understood the implications. "Romano, are you saying we're dealing with foreign technical advisors?" "Possible, Chief, or Taliban bomb makers who've received advanced training. Either way, this isn't the improvised explosive network we were briefed about. This is a defensive engineering system designed by someone who understands how we operate." The revelation added another layer of danger to an already lethal situation. If Taliban forces had access to advanced technical training, it meant their capabilities were evolving faster than American intelligence had recognized. The improvised explosive devices that had characterized earlier phases of the Afghan conflict were being replaced by sophisticated defensive networks that could anticipate and counter American tactics. Captain Hayes monitored Izzy's progress from his position behind the disabled lead vehicle, his anxiety increasing with every report of unexpected complexity. "Romano, I need regular status updates. How long before you can identify a viable extraction route?" Izzy paused her advance to analyze a particularly complex electromagnetic signature that suggested multiple devices connected through a single trigger mechanism. "Sir, I need time to read the pattern properly. Rushing through this analysis could trigger the entire network. Time is what we don't have, Romano. Davis is critical, and intelligence reports suggest Taliban reinforcements are moving toward our position." The pressure to work faster created exactly the conditions that led to mistakes in explosive ordnance disposal. Izzy had seen too many good soldiers killed because commanders demanded speed over precision in life-threatening situations. But she also understood that Davis was dying while she conducted her analysis. "Chief Donovan," she called quietly, "I'm going to attempt something unconventional. The electromagnetic pattern suggests the devices are networked through a central control system. If I can locate and disable the control node, it might create a safe passage through the entire system." Donovan's silence lasted several seconds as she processed the implications of Izzy's proposal. Attempting to disable a central control system was extremely dangerous because it required getting close enough to the most heavily protected part of the network to conduct detailed analysis. If Izzy's assessment was wrong, or if the Taliban had anticipated this approach, she could trigger the entire defensive system simultaneously. "Romano, that's an extremely high-risk approach. If the control system has anti-tampering devices, you could detonate everything at once. Chief, conventional clearance methods will take too long. This is our best chance of getting Davis and the others out of here alive." From his position monitoring Taliban radio traffic, Corporal Cross provided an update that added urgency to Izzy's mission. "All stations, I'm detecting increased communications activity on Taliban command frequencies. Pattern analysis suggests they're coordinating for a major assault on our position." Hayes absorbed this information with growing panic. The tactical situation was deteriorating on multiple fronts, casualties mounting, enemy reinforcements approaching, weather preventing air support, and his EOD specialist conducting unauthorized operations that could trigger a catastrophic explosion. "Romano," Hayes called urgently, "abort your mission and return to the defensive perimeter immediately. We'll establish a stronger defensive position and wait for conditions to improve." But Izzy had already located what appeared to be the central control node, a sophisticated device buried beneath a seemingly innocent pile of rocks that would be invisible to standard detection methods. The electromagnetic signature was unlike anything in her previous experience, suggesting technology that exceeded typical Taliban capabilities. "Chief, I found something unusual. The control device appears to use commercial electronics integrated with military-grade explosive components. This is definitely not standard Taliban construction." The discovery confirmed what intelligence analysts had suspected, but couldn't prove that Taliban forces were receiving technical support from sources with access to advanced military technology. The implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation, but Izzy's focus remained on the immediate problem of creating a safe passage for the wounded soldiers. "Romano," Donovan's voice carried the weight of 20 years of experience with explosive devices. "Describe exactly what you're seeing. I need to understand the configuration before you attempt any disabling procedures." Izzy knelt beside the concealed device, her pink helmet making her visible to both her American colleagues and the Taliban fighters who were tracking her movement through rifle scopes. The irony was not lost on her. The helmet that Hayes had, criticized for drawing attention, was now serving as a visual reference point for friendly forces while she conducted the most dangerous mission of her career. Chief, the device appears to have multiple input channels connected to sensors throughout the IED network. There's a central processing unit that looks like modified commercial hardware, and several output channels that presumably control individual explosive charges. Can you identify the power source and primary trigger mechanism? Izzy carefully traced the visible wiring while her detection equipment analyzed the electromagnetic signatures of components she couldn't see. Power appears to be battery-based with solar backup. Primary trigger looks like a combination of pressure sensors, infrared detection, and possibly radio command capability. The complexity of the system was both impressive and terrifying. Taliban bomb makers had created a defensive network that could detect approaching vehicles, distinguish between different types of targets, and coordinate explosive responses across a wide area. The level of sophistication suggested months of planning and access to technical resources that exceeded previous intelligence estimates. "Romeo 6, this is Romano," she called to Hayes while continuing her analysis. "I believe I can disable the central control system, but I need permission to proceed. The risk is significant, but it's our best chance of creating a safe extraction route." Hayes faced the decision that would define his leadership and determine the fate of every soldier under his command. He could authorize an unconventional approach that violated standard procedures, or he could maintain rigid adherence to protocol while soldiers died around him. The pink helmet that had symbolized everything Hayes opposed about modern military culture was about to become either the key to salvation or the marker of a tragic miscalculation in the deadly mountains of Afghanistan. The silence stretched across the valley for what felt like an eternity as Captain Hayes grappled with the most important decision of his military career. Through his binoculars, he could see Staff Sergeant Romano kneeling beside the central control device, her pink helmet making her an obvious target for Taliban snipers who were undoubtedly tracking her every movement. Behind him, Corporal Davis's breathing grew increasingly labored as his life ebbed away with each passing second. "Sir." Sergeant Johnson's voice crackled through the radio with barely controlled desperation. "Davis is going into cardiac arrest. We need to move him now, or we're going to lose him right here." The medical crisis forced Hayes to confront the mathematical reality of command decisions. Every minute of delay increased the probability that Davis would die while authorizing. Romano's unconventional approach carried the risk of triggering an explosion that could kill multiple soldiers simultaneously. The clean theoretical frameworks he had studied in officer training provided no guidance for situations where every available option carried unacceptable risks. "Romano," Hayes called, his voice betraying the internal conflict that was tearing him apart. "I need a realistic assessment of your chances of success. Can you disable that control system without triggering the entire network?" Izzy studied the device with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through countless dangerous missions. The central control unit was more sophisticated than anything she had encountered in 3 deployments, but the basic principles of explosive ordnance disposal remained consistent. Every bomb maker, no matter how skilled, had to balance complexity with reliability, and that balance created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with sufficient expertise. "Sir, I'm seeing standard commercial electronics integrated with military-grade components. The trigger mechanisms appear to have built-in safeguards to prevent accidental detonation, which means there should be a way to safely interrupt the control signals. What should be and will be were very different things in the unforgiving mathematics of explosive ordnance disposal." Chief Donovan, who had survived 20 years of defusing bombs precisely because she never made assumptions about enemy capabilities, provided the voice of caution that Hayes needed to hear. "Captain," Donovan called from her position monitoring the operation, "Romano's assessment is reasonable, but we're dealing with technology that exceeds our previous intelligence estimates. There's always the possibility that this system includes countermeasures we haven't anticipated." The acknowledgement of uncertainty was both honest and terrifying. In the Afghan mountains, where Taliban forces had demonstrated increasing sophistication in their defensive tactics, American soldiers were being forced to operate beyond the boundaries of their training and doctrine. The mission that had begun as a routine IED clearance operation had evolved into a desperate gamble against an adaptive enemy who understood how to exploit American predictability. "Thunder Base, Romeo 6, Hayes called to FOB Thunder, seeking guidance from Colonel Pierce, who was monitoring the situation from the relative safety of the operations center. "Request immediate guidance on authorization for unconventional EOD procedures. We have critical casualties and limited options for extraction." Pierce's response carried the weight of a commander who understood that some decisions could not be made by remote control. "Romeo 6, you are the ground commander with direct assessment of tactical conditions. I trust your judgment regarding appropriate risk levels for current circumstances." The delegation of authority was both a vote of confidence and a burden of responsibility that Hayes had never wanted to carry. Pierce was forcing him to make the decision that would define his leadership and determine whether the soldiers under his command lived or died, based on his assessment of acceptable risk. From his communications position, Corporal Cross provided an update that added another layer of urgency to the already desperate situation. "Romeo 6, Taliban radio traffic indicates assault forces are moving to final positions. Intelligence estimates suggest we have maybe 10 minutes before they launch a coordinated attack on our position." The prospect of facing a Taliban assault while trapped in the IED kill zone was effectively a death sentence for the entire convoy. Hayes realized that maintaining his defensive position was no longer a viable option. They had to find a way out of the valley before enemy reinforcements arrived, or they would all share Davis's fate. "Romano," Hayes called, his voice carrying a resignation that reflected his acceptance of the impossible choice he faced. "You are authorized to attempt disabling the central control system. But I want continuous updates on your progress, and abort immediately if you encounter unexpected complications." The authorization represented a fundamental shift in Hayes's approach to command, though he seemed unaware of the broader implications. For the first time in his career, he was prioritizing practical effectiveness over procedural compliance, trusting the expertise of a subordinate whose methods he had consistently questioned. "Roger, sir," Izzy replied, her voice steady despite the enormous pressure of the situation. "Beginning disabling procedures now. Chief Donovan, I'll need you to monitor electromagnetic signatures for any changes that might indicate system activation." Izzy began the delicate process of tracing the control system's wiring while her detection equipment analyzed the electronic signatures of components she couldn't see. The device was a masterpiece of improvised engineering, combining commercial electronics with military-grade explosives in ways that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both American tactics and advanced bomb-making techniques. "Chief, I'm seeing power distribution networks that suggest this system controls at least 12 separate explosive charges positioned throughout the valley. If I can interrupt the central processing unit, it should create a safe corridor approximately 15 meters wide. The corridor would be just wide enough for the convoy's vehicles to navigate single file, but it would require precise coordination and perfect timing to extract all personnel before the Taliban assault began. More importantly, it required complete trust in Romano's assessment of the system's vulnerabilities, trust that Hayes had been reluctant to provide until circumstances forced his hand. "Romano, how long do you need to complete the disabling sequence?" Hayes asked, watching Taliban muzzle flashes appear from new positions that suggested the assault was imminent. "Sir, Give me 3 minutes to trace the primary circuits and identify the safest interruption points. The actual disabling should take less than 30 seconds if everything goes according to plan. If everything goes according to plan. The phrase carried enormous weight in a tactical environment where enemy forces were adaptive. Technology was unpredictable, and human error could trigger catastrophic explosions. Hayes found himself placing the survival of his entire command in the hands of a soldier whose expertise he had questioned and whose methods he had dismissed. Through his binoculars, he watched Romano work with the calm precision of someone who had faced death so many times that fear had been replaced by professional focus. Her pink helmet, which had generated so much controversy and resentment, now served as a symbol of hope for soldiers who had run out of conventional options. Davis is crashing. Johnson's voice cut through the radio static with the urgency of a combat medic who was losing a patient. His pulse is barely detectable. We need to move him in the next 2 minutes, or we're going to lose him right here. The convergence of multiple crises: dying soldier, approaching enemy assault, sophisticated explosive network, and deteriorating weather conditions created exactly the kind of complex emergency that revealed the true character of military leaders. Hayes had spent his career avoiding such moments, but the mountains of Afghanistan had finally forced him to confront the reality that leadership meant making impossible decisions with incomplete information and accepting responsibility for outcomes beyond his control. In the deadly quiet of the Korengal Valley, where Taliban fighters prepared for their final assault and American soldiers fought for their lives, Staff Sergeant Isabella Romano represented the last hope for survival. Her unconventional methods and controversial equipment had become the thin line between life and death for soldiers who had learned too late to appreciate expertise over appearances. Staff Sergeant Isabella Romano's hands moved with surgical precision as she traced the intricate wiring of the Taliban control system, her years of experience guiding her through the most complex explosive network she had ever encountered. The pink helmet that had generated so much ridicule now served as a beacon of hope for soldiers whose lives depended on her ability to accomplish what standard procedures had failed to achieve. Through her radio earpiece, she could hear Corporal Davis's increasingly erratic breathing as his life hung in the balance. "Chief Donovan, I've identified the primary power distribution node," Izzy reported quietly, her voice steady despite the enormous pressure of the situation. "The system appears to use redundant circuits with automatic failover capabilities, but I'm seeing a vulnerability in the central processing unit that should allow clean shutdown." Donovan monitored the electromagnetic readings from her position behind the convoy's defensive perimeter, her 20 years of experience providing the technical oversight that gave Izzy's operation its best chance of success. "Romano, I'm reading stable electromagnetic signatures across the network. No indication of anti-tampering activation. You're clear to proceed with the disabling sequence." The technical confirmation provided the confidence Izzy needed to begin the most dangerous phase of the operation. She carefully exposed the central processing unit, revealing a sophisticated device that combined commercial smartphone technology with military-grade triggering mechanisms. The engineering was impressive and terrifying. Taliban bomb makers had created a system that could coordinate multiple explosive charges while maintaining the flexibility to adapt to change in tactical conditions. "Sir," Izzy called the captain. "Hayes, I'm beginning the shutdown sequence. The system has multiple safeguards, so I need to disable them in specific order to prevent automatic detonation. Estimated completion time is 90 seconds. Hayes monitored her progress through binoculars, while simultaneously tracking Taliban movement patterns that suggested the enemy assault was imminent. The convergence of multiple time-sensitive crises created exactly the kind of complex emergency that separated competent leaders from those who collapsed under pressure. "All stations, this is Cross," came the urgent voice of the communications specialist. Taliban radio traffic indicates assault forces are moving to final positions. Intelligence. Estimates we have less than 5 minutes before they attack. The time pressure was almost unbearable, but Izzy forced herself to maintain the methodical approach that had kept her alive through countless dangerous missions. Rushing through explosive ordnance disposal procedures was the fastest way to trigger accidental detonations, regardless of external pressures or tactical urgencies. First safeguard disabled, she reported, carefully disconnecting a wire that controlled the system's motion sensors. No response from the network, proceeding to second safeguard. The second safeguard proved more complex, requiring Izzy to distinguish between legitimate control circuits and decoy wiring designed to trigger detonation if tampered with incorrectly. The Taliban engineers had anticipated that American E-aid specialists might attempt to disable the system, and they had included countermeasures that would kill anyone who made the wrong choice. Chief, I'm seeing conflicting electromagnetic signatures. In the secondary circuit, 2 wires appear to carry identical voltage levels, but one of them is probably a trap. I need 30 seconds to analyze the harmonic patterns. 30 seconds felt like an eternity when Taliban fighters were positioning for their final assault, and Davis was dying from blood loss. Hayes found himself torn between the desire to demand faster progress and the understanding that rushing could trigger an explosion that would kill everyone in the convoy. Romeo 6, this is Johnson, came the desperate voice of the combat medic. Davis is unresponsive. I'm losing him fast. We need to move now, or it won't matter if we clear the IED field. The medical crisis added another layer of urgency to an already impossible situation, but Izzy maintained her focus on the technical challenge that represented their only hope of escape. Chief Donovan, harmonic analysis indicates the left side wire is the legitimate control circuit. The right side wire shows frequency patterns consistent with anti-tampering devices. Roger, Romano. Trust your analysis and proceed. Izzy carefully disconnected the left side wire, holding her breath as she waited for any indication that she had triggered the system's defenses. The electromagnetic readings remained stable, confirming that her assessment had been correct. Second safeguard disabled. Network remains stable. Beginning final shutdown sequence. The final phase required disabling the system's central processing unit without triggering the backup power supply that would maintain explosive capability even after primary circuits were interrupted. It was the most dangerous part of the entire operation, requiring Izzy to work directly with the components that controlled enough explosive power to destroy the entire convoy. Final circuit exposed, she reported, studying the sophisticated device that represented months of Taliban engineering. Effort. Initiating shutdown in 3.2.1. The moment she disconnected the final control wire, the electromagnetic readings across the valley changed dramatically. Donovan's detection equipment showed the systematic shutdown of explosive devices throughout the network, creating the safe corridor that would allow the convoy to escape the kill zone. Network is down, Donovan called excitedly. I'm reading dead circuits across the entire IED field. Romano, you did it. The successful disabling of the Taliban defensive system created an opportunity that had to be exploited immediately. Hayes, who had spent the entire mission questioning Izzy's methods and expertise, now found himself dependent on her continued leadership to coordinate the convoy's escape. Romano, can you guide us through this safe corridor? I need you to mark the route that avoids any remaining hazards. Izzy quickly gathered her equipment and began the process of identifying the safest path through the valley. Her electromagnetic detection gear showed clear readings where the disabled IED network no longer posed a threat, creating a narrow but viable route that could accommodate the convoy's vehicles. Romeo 6, safe corridor is approximately 12 meters wide, beginning 50 meters northeast of our current position. I'll mark the route with chemical markers as we advance. The extraction began with desperate efficiency as soldiers loaded the wounded Davis into the lead vehicle while maintaining defensive positions against potential Taliban small arms fire. The enemy assault that had seemed imminent was temporarily disrupted by confusion over why their sophisticated explosive network had suddenly gone silent. "Move! Move! Move!" Hayes called as the convoy began its escape from the valley, following the route that Izzy marked with her chemical indicators. The pink helmet that had caused so much controversy now served as a visible guide for drivers, navigating the narrow corridor between life and death. "Thunder Base, Romeo 6, Hayes called as the convoy cleared the IED field and began climbing towards safer terrain. "Casualties are loaded, and we're moving to Extraction Point Alpha." Romano successfully disabled the entire Taliban defensive network. Colonel Pierce's response carried the relief of a commander who had been preparing for the worst possible outcome. "Romeo 6, outstanding work. Medical teams are standing by at Extraction Point Alpha. What's the status of your personnel?" Hayes looked through his rear window at Izzy, whose pink helmet was visible in the following vehicle as she continued to monitor electromagnetic readings to ensure they remained in the safe corridor. The soldier he had dismissed and marginalized had become the person who saved everyone's life. "Thunder Base, all personnel accounted for." Staff Sergeant Romano's expertise was decisive in mission success. The admission carried weight that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. In the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, where Taliban forces had demonstrated sophisticated defensive capabilities, an American soldier with a pink helmet had proven that competence mattered more than conformity, and that expertise could overcome prejudice. When survival was at stake. As the convoy reached safety and medical teams began treating Davis's critical injuries, Izzy reflected on the mission that had tested everything she believed about duty, courage, and the price of standing up for principles in an environment that valued conformity over capability. The pink helmet had become more than just protective equipment. It was a symbol of the idea that strength came in many forms, and that sometimes the most unlikely heroes were the ones who saved everyone else. The medical evacuation helicopter touched down at Forward Operating Base Thunder, with the distinctive whine of rotors cutting through the thin mountain air, carrying Corporal Nathan Davis and the other wounded soldiers to advanced medical facilities, where trauma surgeons would work to save lives that had hung in the balance just hours earlier. Staff Sergeant Isabella Romano stood at the edge of the landing zone, her pink helmet tucked under her arm, watching as medics rushed Davis toward the waiting aircraft on a stretcher that carried the weight of her successful mission. Colonel Diana Pierce emerged from the operations center as the convoy vehicles rolled through the base's main gate, their armor scarred by bullet impacts, and their occupants bearing the exhausted expressions of soldiers who had survived an impossible situation. Pierce had monitored the entire operation from the communications center, listening to radio traffic that had ranged from desperate to triumphant as the mission evolved from disaster to successful extraction. "Romano," Pierce called as Izzy walked toward the vehicle depot to secure her equipment. "I need to see you in my office immediately." The summons carried an ominous tone that could indicate either commendation or court-martial proceedings. Izzy had violated direct orders from Captain Hayes when she left the defensive perimeter to conduct her unauthorized reconnaissance, and military justice could be unforgiving toward soldiers who challenged authority regardless of their ultimate success. Captain Hayes dismounted from the lead vehicle with obvious reluctance, his uniform torn and dusty from the realities of combat operations that had exposed the limitations of his theoretical approach to leadership. Throughout the return journey, he had maintained radio silence except for essential tactical communications, avoiding the conversations that would force him to acknowledge how completely his assumptions about military effectiveness had been proven wrong. "Captain Hayes," Pierce continued, her voice carrying the authority of a commander who who had observed the entire mission unfold through radio reports and satellite surveillance. "I want a complete after-action report on my desk within 2 hours. Include detailed analysis of decision-making processes, tactical effectiveness, and personnel performance." The request for detailed analysis was standard procedure after any mission involving casualties and equipment loss. But Pierce's emphasis on decision-making processes suggested that Hayes's leadership would face scrutiny that extended far beyond routine administrative review. The mission had been successful, but success achieved despite poor command decisions carried different implications than success achieved because of effective leadership. Chief Warrant Officer Patricia Donovan approached the group with a thick folder of technical documentation about the Taliban IED network that Romano had successfully disabled. Her 20 years of explosive ordnance disposal experience had never encountered a defensive system of such sophistication, and the intelligence value of Izzy's discoveries would influence American tactical doctrine for years to come. "Colonel," Donovan began, "Romano's technical analysis of the Taliban network has revealed capabilities that significantly exceed our previous intelligence estimates. The enemy is using advanced electronics and engineering techniques that suggest formal training from sources with military-grade expertise." Pierce studied the preliminary technical reports while considering the broader implications of Donovan's assessment. If Taliban forces had access to advanced training and sophisticated equipment, it meant the insurgency was evolving faster than American intelligence had recognized, requiring fundamental changes in tactical approach and resource allocation. "Chief Donovan, I want Romano to participate in a complete technical debrief with intelligence specialists. Her first-hand analysis of that network could provide critical insights into enemy capabilities and vulnerabilities." The assignment represented significant recognition of Izzy's expertise, elevating her from a marginalized EOD specialist to a key intelligence asset whose knowledge would inform strategic decision-making at levels far above forward operating base thunder. But it also meant that her unauthorized actions during the mission would be scrutinized by intelligence professionals who understood the value of initiative in complex tactical situations. Lieutenant Chloe Bennett had been monitoring Taliban radio communications throughout the convoy's return journey, and her analysis revealed the extent to which Izzy's successful disabling of the IED network had disrupted enemy operations throughout the Korengal Valley. The Taliban forces that had been preparing for a coordinated assault were now struggling to understand how their sophisticated defensive system had been defeated by a single American soldier. "Ma'am," Bennett reported to Pierce, "Taliban communications indicate significant confusion about the failure of their IED network. Intelligence intercepts suggest they're questioning whether their own technical advisors sabotaged the system." The psychological impact of Izzy's success extended beyond the immediate tactical situation, creating doubt and suspicion within Taliban ranks about the reliability of their most advanced defensive capabilities. Enemy forces that had invested months in developing sophisticated explosive networks now faced the reality that American EOD specialists could defeat their best efforts using methods they didn't understand. Sergeant First Class Andre Johnson, who had treated Davis's critical injuries throughout the extraction, approached the group with obvious satisfaction about the mission's outcome. As a combat medic with multiple deployments, Johnson understood better than most how rarely impossible situations resulted in successful outcomes, and he wanted to ensure that Romano received appropriate recognition for her life-saving expertise. "Colonel," Johnson said, "I want it on record that Romano's actions saved Davis's life. Without her ability to create that escape corridor, we would have lost him and probably several other soldiers as well." The medical perspective added weight to the growing consensus that Izzy's unauthorized initiative had been not just successful, but essential for preventing multiple casualties. Johnson's statement would become part of the official record, providing documentation that her violation of Hayes's orders had been justified by the tactical necessities of the situation. Hayes listened to the praise for Romano with visible discomfort, realizing that his resistance to her methods and his attempts to marginalize her expertise had been not just wrong, but potentially deadly. The soldier he had dismissed as unprofessional had demonstrated competence that exceeded his own abilities, while his insistence on following standard procedures had nearly resulted in disaster. "Sir," Hayes said to Pierce, his voice carrying the weight of someone forced to confront his own limitations, "I want to acknowledge that Staff Sergeant Romano's expertise was decisive in mission success. Her methods were unconventional, but they were effective when conventional approaches failed." The admission represented a fundamental shift in Hayes's understanding of military effectiveness, though it came at the cost of public acknowledgement that his leadership had been inadequate for the challenges they faced. The officer who had built his career on procedural compliance and political connections now faced the reality that combat operations required qualities he had never developed. Pierce observed the exchanges with the calculating expression of a commander who understood that personnel decisions had implications extending far beyond individual careers. The mission in the Pech Valley had revealed strengths and weaknesses in her command, structure that would influence future assignments, and leadership development throughout the base. "Romano," Pierce said finally, "report to my office at 1400 hours for detailed debrief. Bring all technical documentation from your analysis of the Taliban network. Your expertise is going to be valuable for intelligence assessment and tactical development." As the group dispersed to handle the administrative aftermath of the mission, Izzy reflected on the transformation that had occurred in the span of a single day. The soldier who had been marginalized for her unconventional equipment and questioned for her judgment had become a valued intelligence asset whose expertise would influence military operations throughout the region. The pink helmet that had generated so much controversy remained tucked under her arm, its bright color no longer a source of ridicule, but a symbol of the courage and competence that had saved lives when traditional approaches failed. In the harsh environment of the Afghan mountains, where Taliban forces had demonstrated sophisticated defensive capabilities, an American soldier with unconventional methods had proven that expertise mattered more than appearances, and that sometimes the most effective warriors were the ones who didn't look like everyone else's idea of what a soldier should be. The investigation into the Pech Valley mission began 3 days later in the sterile environment of the base conference room, where intelligence specialists from Regional Command East had assembled to conduct a comprehensive analysis of what had become known throughout the theater as the Pink Helmet Incident. Staff Sergeant Isabella Romano sat at the head of the conference table, her technical documentation spread across multiple monitors, while senior officers who had never heard her name a week earlier now hung on every word of her tactical assessment. Colonel Pierce had structured the investigation not as a disciplinary proceeding, but as a learning opportunity that would inform tactical doctrine throughout Afghanistan. The sophisticated Taliban IED network that Romano had defeated represented a new level of enemy capability that American forces needed to understand and counter, making her first-hand analysis invaluable for strategic planning at the highest levels of command. "Staff Sergeant Romano," began Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the intelligence officer from Regional Command, "your technical analysis suggests that Taliban forces have access to advanced training and sophisticated equipment that exceeds our previous assessments. Can you elaborate on the specific capabilities you observed?" Izzy referenced her detailed photographs and electromagnetic analysis of the defeated IED network, pointing to engineering features that demonstrated knowledge of American tactical procedures and countermeasures specifically designed to defeat standard EOD protocols. "Ma'am, the system used redundant circuits, anti-tampering devices, and coordination capabilities that suggest formal engineering training. This wasn't improvised bomb-making, it was defensive system engineering." The implications of her assessment reverberated through the assembled intelligence professionals who understood that enemy adaptation required corresponding evolution in American tactics. Mitchell took detailed notes while other specialists asked technical questions that revealed the depth of Romano's expertise and the significance of her discoveries. The central control system, Romano continued, utilized commercial smartphone technology integrated with military-grade triggering mechanisms. The sophistication suggests access to advanced electronics and possibly foreign technical advisors with formal military training. Captain Hayes, who had been relegated to a secondary role in the proceedings, listened to the praise for Romano's expertise with the uncomfortable awareness that his own performance was being evaluated simultaneously. The officer who had dismissed her methods and questioned her judgment now faced scrutiny from commanders who valued results over procedural compliance. Captain Hayes, Colonel Pierce addressed him directly. I want to discuss your decision-making process during the critical phase of the mission. Walk me through your assessment of the tactical situation and your rationale for initially denying Staff Sergeant Romano's request to conduct reconnaissance. Hayes struggled to articulate a defense of decisions that now appeared obviously flawed in retrospect. Ma'am, my priority was maintaining unit cohesion and following established procedures. Romano's methods hadn't been validated through proper testing protocols, and I was concerned about the risk to personnel. Pierce's response carried the weight of a commander who had observed the entire mission through radio traffic and understood the gap between Hayes's theoretical concerns and the practical realities that Romano had navigated successfully. Captain, how do you reconcile your concern about risk to personnel with the fact that following established procedures resulted in multiple casualties while Romano's unconventional methods saved lives? The question exposed the fundamental flaw in Hayes's approach to leadership, his inability to adapt theoretical knowledge to practical situations that required flexibility and judgment. The mission had demonstrated that rigid adherence to doctrine could be more dangerous than calculated risks taken by experienced specialists who understood the nuances of their profession. Chief Warrant Officer Donovan provided technical testimony that further elevated Romano's standing while highlighting the limitations of standard approaches to complex EOD situations. The Taliban network that Staff Sergeant Romano defeated was specifically designed to counter our standard clearance procedures. Her ability to recognize the system's vulnerabilities and develop an effective countermeasure demonstrated expertise that goes far beyond routine technical training. Lieutenant Bennett offered communications analysis that supported the broader narrative of Romano's exceptional performance. Throughout the mission, Staff Sergeant Romano maintained tactical awareness and professional composure under extreme pressure. Her radio communications were clear, accurate, and focused on mission accomplishment rather than personal recognition. The investigation revealed not just Romano's individual competence, but systemic problems within the command structure that had nearly prevented her expertise from being utilized effectively. Pierce recognized that the cultural attitudes that had marginalized Romano were symptomatic of broader issues that needed to be addressed throughout the base. This investigation has revealed several concerning patterns, Pierce announced to the assembled officers. We have personnel with exceptional capabilities who are being underutilized due to prejudices and assumptions that have no basis in performance or competence. These attitudes represent a threat to mission effectiveness and soldier safety. The statement carried implications that extended far beyond Romano's individual situation. Pierce was acknowledging that the military culture at FOB Thunder had created conditions where politics and prejudice could override tactical necessities, potentially resulting in unnecessary casualties and mission failures. Sergeant First Class Johnson provided medical testimony that quantified the life-saving impact of Romano's actions. Corporal Davis would have died if we had remained trapped in that valley for another hour. The blood loss and shock from his injuries required immediate medical intervention that was only possible because Staff Sergeant Romano created the escape route that standard procedures couldn't provide. The medical evidence provided objective validation of Romano's contributions while highlighting the deadly consequences of Hayes's initial resistance to unconventional approaches. Johnson's testimony would become part of the permanent record, documenting how leadership failures could directly threaten soldier survival. Based on the evidence presented, Pierce concluded, I'm implementing several immediate changes to our operational procedures. First, technical specialists will have direct input into mission planning when their expertise is relevant to tactical situations. Second, we're establishing protocols for rapid authorization of unconventional procedures when standard methods prove inadequate. The policy changes represented a fundamental shift in how the base would balance procedural compliance with tactical flexibility. Romano's success had demonstrated that expertise and initiative could be more valuable than rigid adherence to doctrine, forcing the command structure to acknowledge that effective leadership required trusting skilled subordinates to do their jobs. Staff Sergeant Romano, Pierce addressed her directly, you are hereby promoted to Sergeant First Class, effective immediately. Additionally, you're being assigned as the senior EOD specialist for this base, with responsibility for training and doctrine development. The promotion and assignment represented complete vindication of Romano's approach and expertise. The soldier who had been marginalized and questioned was now being elevated to a position where she could influence how future soldiers would be trained and equipped for similar challenges. As the investigation concluded and officers filed out of the conference room, Romano reflected on the transformation that had occurred not just in her own status, but in the base's understanding of what constituted effective military leadership. The pink helmet that had once symbolized nonconformity was now recognized as a marker of the courage and individuality that could save lives when conventional wisdom failed. The systemic changes that Pierce had announced would benefit not just Romano, but future soldiers who brought unconventional skills and perspectives to military challenges. The culture of dismissal and prejudice that had nearly prevented a life-saving mission was being replaced by a meritocracy that valued competence over conformity. 6 months after the Coringal Valley mission, forward operating base Thunder had transformed into something unrecognizable from the institution that had once questioned whether a pink helmet belonged in a combat zone. Sergeant First Class Isabella Romano stood in the EOD training facility she had designed, watching a new generation of explosive ordnance disposal specialists learn techniques that combine traditional doctrine with the innovative approaches that had saved lives in the Afghan mountains. The training facility itself bore little resemblance to the sterile, regulation-focused environment that had characterized military instruction under the previous command structure. Romano had implemented a curriculum that emphasized adaptability, creative problem-solving, and the kind of tactical flexibility that enabled specialists to respond effectively to enemy innovations. The walls were covered with photographs and technical diagrams from real-world missions, including detailed analysis of the sophisticated Taliban network that had nearly trapped an entire convoy. Sergeant Romano called Private First Class Maria Santos, one of the new EOD students, who had arrived at FOB Thunder, specifically requesting assignment to Romano's training program. I'm having trouble understanding how you identified the vulnerability in the central control system. The electromagnetic signatures look identical to me. Romano smiled as she approached Santos's workstation, remembering her own early struggles to distinguish between legitimate circuits and anti-tampering devices. The teaching role had given her new appreciation for the complexity of the skills she had developed through years of dangerous experience, and she took satisfaction in passing that knowledge to soldiers who would face similar challenges in future deployments. Santos, the key is understanding that bomb makers think like engineers, even when they're trying to be deceptive. Every system has to balance complexity with reliability, and that balance creates patterns you can learn to recognize. She guided Santos through the analysis process, pointing out subtle variations in electromagnetic signatures that indicated different types of circuits and components. The lesson was both technical and philosophical. Romano was teaching not just how to identify specific threats, but how to think systematically about complex problems that didn't have obvious solutions. Lieutenant Chloe Bennett, who had been promoted to captain and assigned as the base operations officer, entered the training facility with a stack of intelligence reports about Taliban tactical evolution throughout the region. Bennett had become one of Romano's strongest allies, using her position to ensure that unconventional expertise was integrated into mission planning rather than marginalized by traditionalist officers. Izzy, Bennett said, using the informal address that reflected their partnership rather than strict military hierarchy. Intelligence is reporting that Taliban forces throughout the region have stopped using the sophisticated eyed networks we encountered in Korangal. Your success apparently convinced them that the technology was too vulnerable to American countermeasures. The strategic impact of Romano's individual action extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation where it had occurred. Taliban forces that had invested heavily in advanced defensive systems were now questioning whether their sophisticated approaches provided sufficient advantage to justify the complexity and expense. The psychological effect of having their best technology defeated by a single American soldier had forced enemy commanders to reconsider their tactical doctrine. That's both good and bad news, Romano replied, considering the broader implications of Bennett's intelligence assessment. Good because it means fewer soldiers will face those kinds of networks. Bad because it means the Taliban will probably develop different approaches that we haven't encountered yet. The conversation reflected Romano's evolution from a specialist focused on individual missions to a strategic thinker whose expertise influenced tactical development throughout the theater. Her success in the Pech Valley had demonstrated that individual competence could have systemic effects, changing not just American doctrine but enemy behavior as well. Colonel Pierce entered the training facility for her weekly assessment of the EOD program's development. Pierce had used Romano's success as a catalyst for broader changes in base culture, transforming Phobe Thunder into a model for other installations, struggling to balance military tradition with the practical demands of modern warfare. Sergeant Romano, Pierce announced, I've received authorization to expand your training program to other bases throughout Regional Command East. Your techniques are being incorporated into official EOD doctrine, and you're being assigned to develop training materials for use throughout the theater. The assignment represented recognition that Romano's methods had proven valuable not just in one exceptional situation, but as systematic approaches that could benefit soldiers facing similar challenges throughout Afghanistan. Her techniques would now be taught to hundreds of EOD specialists, potentially saving countless lives through the multiplication of expertise that had been proven effective under the most demanding conditions. Ma'am, Romano replied, I'm honored by the assignment, but I want to ensure that we're not just teaching techniques. We need to teach soldiers to think adaptively and trust their expertise even when it conflicts with standard procedures. Pierce nodded, understanding that Romano's greatest contribution wasn't any specific technical innovation, but her demonstration that effective military leadership required creating conditions where competent soldiers could use their expertise to solve complex problems. The pink helmet controversy had become a symbol of the broader principle that military effectiveness depended on utilizing all available talent regardless of whether it fit traditional expectations. The transformation at Phobe Thunder had profound effects on personnel throughout the base. Soldiers who had previously felt marginalized because their skills or perspectives didn't align with conventional military culture now found opportunities to contribute meaningfully to mission success. The meritocracy that Pierce had established created an environment where competence mattered more than conformity. Captain Hayes, who had requested transfer to a logistics position after the investigation into his leadership failures, had become an unlikely advocate for the changes that Romano's success had inspired. His public acknowledgement of his mistakes and his support for new approaches to military leadership had helped legitimize the cultural transformation throughout the base. As evening approached and the training session concluded, Romano stood on the observation deck overlooking the valley where her career had been transformed by a single mission that tested everything she believed about duty, competence, and courage. The pink helmet sat on her desk in the training facility, no longer a source of controversy, but a reminder of the importance of maintaining personal connections to the values that made dangerous work meaningful. The memorial garden that had been established near the base chapel included a special section dedicated to soldiers who had demonstrated exceptional courage in saving their comrades' lives. Romano's name was inscribed alongside those of other soldiers whose actions had exemplified the military values of selfless service and personal courage. But her entry was unique in acknowledging not just her bravery, but her persistence in maintaining her expertise despite institutional resistance. Young soldiers who arrived at Fob Thunder now heard Romano's story as part of their orientation, learning about the importance of individual initiative and the value of diverse perspectives in solving complex military challenges. The pink helmet had become part of base folklore, a symbol of the idea that true strength came from competence and character rather than conformity to arbitrary standards. As stars appeared in the clear Afghan sky, Romano reflected on the path that had led from ridicule and marginalization to recognition and respect. The journey had been difficult and sometimes lonely, but it had demonstrated that individual soldiers could change military culture when they had the courage to stand up for their principles and the competence to prove their worth when the stakes were highest. The pink helmet that had once symbolized everything wrong with modern military culture had become a beacon of everything right about soldiers who refused to compromise their values or their expertise in service to their country and their comrades. In the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, where courage came in many forms, Staff Sergeant Isabella Romano had proven that sometimes the most unlikely heroes were exactly the ones everyone needed. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.